This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 336 entitled Avoiding the Special Pleading Fallacy. So this week we're going to continue our study of logical fallacies and how to avoid them. And the goal of this series is really to help listeners better understand how logic is supposed to work in order that we can be more successful in our discussions about God and Christ with others, in our teaching of other people about biblical topics, in our evangelism, and in our personal debates. I do think that we really should be able to understand these individual fallacies, and we should know why they're problematic, why we should stop using them. We should recognize when we accidentally commit them in our own lives, and we should really work to eradicate the fallacies from our thinking, discussions, and debates. Last week, we examined the straw man fallacy, and we noted how it is commonly used in discussions about the identity of God and Christ. This week's episode will examine another common logical fallacy, the special pleading fallacy, which is also called the moving the goalpost fallacy. So we'll hear it described in both ways, the special pleading fallacy and moving the goalpost. As we will soon see, this particular fallacy is when we change the criteria for an argument when a counter-argument is actually proposed that legitimately meets the original conditions, and thereby we are moving the goalpost of successfully answering an objection farther away. And this happens when the definitions are changed and when they're not taken seriously based on what they were originally said in the first argument. So, what are some common special pleading examples? How can we identify when we and others commit them? Why are they unhelpful in dialogues about God and Jesus? And how should we debate and discuss theology without falling prey to the fallacy of special pleading? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the fallacy of special pleading. So the special pleading fallacy, or the moving the goalpost fallacy, occurs when somebody changes the criteria for success or the requirements for an argument in response to a counter-argument. And in theological debates, especially those involving the Trinity and the identity of God and the identity of Christ, this fallacy occurs all the time. Before we look at specific examples within discussions of biblical studies, I wanted to give some examples that are just used in common everyday culture. Let's kind of make sure that we clearly understand when this fallacy appears, how we can recognize it, why the fallacy is something that needs to be avoided, and then we can shift our study to looking at examples within discussions of biblical studies. So, imagine a sports fan saying that a particular player needs to achieve a certain statistic, like scoring 30 touchdowns in a season in order to be considered the best. That's the category, the best. If you want to be the best, you have to score 30 touchdowns. Now, whenever that player achieves the statistic, the fan might then argue that, well, you need to actually also have a certain number of championships or records in order to be considered the best. And so what had happened there is that there was a certain requirement in order to be defined as the best, and whenever that requirement was met, the person making the original argument did not want to concede defeat, and so he moved the goalpost. He changed the requirements. He changed the criteria in order to allow his original argument to continue to stand. And that, of course, is not fair to the person who is making the counter argument. Here's another example. A sports team, needs to win 5 championships in order to be considered the best. Okay, but when that team actually does win 5 championships, some people might say, well, the team needs to win 6 championships, and they need to, at the same time, defeat their rival in each of those seasons in order to be considered the best. So you can see we are actually moving the goalpost based on what the original defined parameters were, the criteria and the requirements, and that's unfair to the people that are making the counter argument. So how does this work out in the realm of an employer and an employee and job performance? So let's just say that an employee is told that if they want to get a promotion, they need to achieve a certain metric of performance. And then the employee actually meets those metrics of performance, but then the employer says that, well, you also need to demonstrate some leadership skills, or you need to take on some additional responsibilities. And so what has happened is that the goalposts have been moved from the original agreed upon definition of what it meant to achieve a promotion. And that is unfair to the employee. Any person who's had these sort of conversations will know exactly what I am talking about. What about in the realm of friendships and relationships? So let's just say that in a relationship, one partner might say to the other partner that that person will only be happy if the second person changes a specific behavior. Like, if you give up smoking, then I will be happy. So then the second partner gives up smoking, but the first partner is going to shift the goalpost. They're going to make the case of special pleading in order to say, well, I also want you to give up drinking, and I want you to shave, and I want you to stop snoring, and once you do all these things, then I will truly be happy. They have made a case of special pleading. They have moved the goalpost. They've shifted the goalpost in order to further define the original meaning of what was supposed to be achieved in order for them to be happy. So hopefully you can see how these examples define the case of special pleading. So why is the case of special pleading or moving the goalpost a fallacy? Why is it something that we should avoid? Well, it's clearly unfair. It's unfair to change the conditions after they have been met, because it actually gives a suggestion that there is no evidence that will ever be acceptable. If your dialogue partner says that I'm looking for this piece of evidence in order to prove me wrong, and then you provide that evidence and they say, well, that's not actually evidence, or I need multiple pieces of evidence, or I need additional conditions, then it's unfair to you because you've actually fulfilled the requirements and the criteria that were originally stated. It's problematic because it demonstrates avoidance. Those who commit the special pleading fallacy avoid admitting defeat or accepting that one of your arguments is actually a good, legitimate argument that is contradicting their position or their belief. And so they're just avoiding the evidence that you are providing. And it really just leads to a stalemate. It prevents any charitable, productive, or meaningful resolution to a discussion because the goalposts are continually moved farther and farther away in order to avoid any counter evidence and in order to evade counter arguments. So let's move to our second point, point number 2, common special pleading or moving the goalpost fallacies in Christological debates. And I've watched several debates between Unitarians and Trinitarians, debates between Unitarians and Arians, debates between Trinitarians and Arians, whatever order you want to put them together, all parties fall prey to committing the fallacy of special pleading. Here's a common example. A Trinitarian might claim that the Bible explicitly supports the doctrine of the Trinity. So someone who is not convinced of that claim might point out that there's just no evidence of the Trinity in the Bible. There's no mentioning of the Trinity in the Bible. The word Trinity is simply unbiblical. But then the Trinitarian is going to commit the fallacy. They're going to shift the goalpost, and they're going to say that the doctrine is implicitly supported with a bunch of verses that when you put them all together and you read them in the right way, then the doctrine is there, but it's not explicitly stated. And thereby they have committed the fallacy of special pleading. They originally said that it is explicitly supported by the Bible. But when evidence is brought to their attention that this is not the case, they said, well, it's actually implicitly supported by a bunch of tiny verses that you have to put together and read just in the right way. Here's another example. A Trinitarian might suggest that the early church fathers unanimously supported the Trinity and taught the doctrine to their followers. Now, a counter-argument would be put forth by presenting various quotes from the church fathers that indicate that they don't believe the doctrine of the Trinity or have any idea of what that doctrine actually is. But then the fallacy of special pleading occurs. The Trinitarian will say that the writings of the church fathers need to be interpreted in light of the entire body of their work and in continuity with the supposed teachings of the New Testament in order to find the evidence for the Trinity. They'll say you can't just take a couple of these verses. You got to read it all together and in continuity with the New Testament. But they have now moved the goalpost. Their original claim was that the early church fathers unanimously supported the Trinity. And that is just certainly not true. Here's another example of moving the goalpost. Someone might assert that the Trinity was always a part of Christian doctrine and teaching from the inception of the early church. Now, a critic might say that the doctrine of the Trinity formally was developed over the course of several centuries and over the course of several church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries. But then the Trinitarian is going to commit the special pleading fallacy. They're going to shift the goalpost by saying that the essence of the Trinity was always present, even if it wasn't formally articulated, and that there wasn't really a development of the doctrine of the Trinity. It was just further clarified and further revealed to the church. It's not a new invention. It was just something that God further revealed to them. But that is moving the goalposts from their original claim. The original claim was that the Trinity was always a part of the Christian doctrine of the early church. It was always there. To shift the goalposts and to say, well, it's implicitly there and it was revealed as a further clarification, is to move the goalpost. That's a fallacy. That's wrong. You can't do that. Here's another example. A Trinitarian might say that the doctrine of the Trinity is logically coherent. It makes sense logically. And of course, someone will come along and present various arguments that show that the Trinity contradicts itself. It's logically contradictory. But then the goalposts get moved. The case of special pleading occurs. And the Trinitarian responds by saying that the Trinity is a mystery and it's beyond human logic and it cannot be fully comprehended or critiqued by human reason alone. You can never really understand God. But even though that is their response, that is committing the fallacy of moving the goalpost. The original claim said that the doctrine of the Trinity is logically coherent. If your response to that is that it is beyond human logic, it's a mystery, and it cannot be comprehended by human reason alone, then you are moving the goalpost. It's unfair. Now, a Trinitarian might also claim, this is another example, that the God of the Bible is the triune God. This is a common logical fallacy that takes place. The God of the Bible is the triune God. Now, I might respond by saying that Jesus had a God. Jesus cried out to someone whom he called my God. Jesus defined the Father as the only true God in John 17:3. So Jesus doesn't seem to define God as the triune God. But then the goalpost gets shifted, and the case of special pleading is actually committed. And the Trinitarian is going to change the definition of God to say that God can sometimes refer to the Father, sometimes it can refer to the Son, and sometimes it can refer to the Holy Spirit. And here are some passages where it refers to God, here are some passages where it refers to Christ, and here are some passages where it seemingly refers to the Holy Spirit. Now, what they've done is they've redefined the meaning of the noun God from their original argument. The original argument was that the God of the Bible is the triune God. And yet, there's no occurrence of the word God in the Bible that is defined as one God in three persons. And Jesus never defined it that way. They have moved the goalpost. Hopefully you can see how this works. Now, I'm picking on the Trinitarians because they're the ones, I think, with the weakest logical argument for their case in Scripture. But biblical Unitarians often commit the special pleading fallacy themselves. I want to give you some examples so that we can see the problem with this argumentation and we can make better arguments. So, Unitarians often demand clear evidence that says that Jesus is God. They'll say, Jesus never said, I am God. They'll say, Jesus is not God. But what will happen is that someone will say, well, look, John 20:28. Thomas said to Jesus, he responded to Jesus, and he said, my Lord and my God. Or in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, where Psalm 45 is quoted in regard to Jesus. In Psalm 45, there was a figure that was called God, and that is quoted in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, in which Jesus is described as God. So there you have it. You can't say that Jesus is not God, and yet Jesus is described as God in at least two passages. Now, Unitarians will sometimes move the goalpost here, and they'll say that, well, these verses are just exceptions. They're a different sense of being God, or they're God in the sense of being a title, or as an agent, or as a representative of God. But the problem there is that the original position should not have been stated in the way that it was, because it opens itself up to this sort of counter-argument, which makes the original claim look very weak. What needs to take place is there needs to be a better definition of what God means in its truest sense, while also acknowledging that the true God, Yahweh, shares his title with qualified agents. And you can show examples of that in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and you can show how the lexicons, the Hebrew and the Greek lexicons, also acknowledge this in their grammatical definitions of the noun God. Here's another place to where I think Unitarians are guilty of the special pleading fallacy. They will say that Jesus did not pre-exist his birth. Jesus Christ had no pre-existence. Now, the counter-argument would be to point out several texts that talk about how the Logos was with God in the beginning, or Jesus saying that there was glory that I had with you before the world was, Jesus claiming to be before Abraham, and how Paul will say that the rock that followed the Israelites in the wilderness was Christ. And here, Unitarians will shift the goalposts, and they'll say that, well, Jesus did pre-exist, but only in God's plans and God's purposes. Or Jesus only pre-existed as God's personified wisdom or God's personified word. That's the best way to interpret these texts. But this is not literal pre-existence. But what has happened there is that there was a shifting of the goalpost. The original claim was that Jesus did not pre-exist, but that is a claim that I think is not clear in order to explain the biblical evidence. As I've demonstrated in several episodes, if you can go back and look at different ways that we talk about pre-existence in the catalog of episodes, Jewish people that discussed and considered the topic of pre-existence understood it in two ways. There wasn't just one definition of pre-existence. Something could pre-exist in God's plans and purposes. That would be a notional pre-existence or an ideal pre-existence. And something could pre-exist literally or consciously. So the question should not be whether Jesus pre-existed or not. It's in what sense did he pre-exist and in what sense did he not pre-exist. So the definition of pre-existence needs to be further defined as opposed to saying that it never took place. Because I do think that the authors of the New Testament ascribe the notional pre-existence in God's plans and purposes to Jesus, and also that Jesus pre-existed as the personified word and wisdom of God. But this is not literal pre-existence, but we need to frame the initial claims much more clearly to avoid committing the special pleading fallacy. So this is going to move us to our third and final point. How can we avoid committing the fallacy of special pleading? So here are several ways in which we can stop making these errors, and we can stop opening ourselves up to these successful counter-arguments, and we can stop looking bad in the way that we communicate our biblical presentations. Number one, you have to set clear criteria from the start of the debate and the discussion. We have to establish specific and measurable criteria for success or proof before entering into a discussion or a debate. We have to define these terms clearly, and we need to ensure that these terms are agreed upon by all parties involved. Every single time that I enter into a debate with somebody, whether it's formal or it's just casual, I ask them to define for me what the God of the Bible actually is. Do they think the God of the Bible is the triune God, or do they think the God of the Bible is defined as something else? And I want them to give me that particular definition. I also have them define for me what they think the doctrine of the Trinity is. Because several people have their own definitions of the doctrine of the Trinity. I want them to give me their definition of the Trinity, and then I'm going to hold them to that so that whenever I point out how it is unbiblical, or it's illogical, or it's logically incoherent, or that it's not present in the early church fathers, they can't move the goalposts from their own definition. So you have to set clear criteria from the start. The second piece of advice is that we have to stick to that agreed upon criteria. Once it's set, all parties need to adhere to it throughout the discussion. If we make a particular claim and they point out that that claim is wrong, we need to acknowledge that they made a good argument, or at least a good counter argument, and that our original argument was not as strong as we had originally thought. We can't keep changing the requirements. We can't change the criteria when the other party legitimately meets the initial conditions. We have to stick to it. We can't move the goalposts because that looks even worse. It looks like we're running away and we're avoiding the truths of the debate. and it opens us up to mockery. Number 3, we need to be humble enough to acknowledge valid points. And this is difficult for people to do because they always come in and they think that their position is the righteous cause and their opponents are the dark side. But sometimes our opponents might present arguments to us that we have never considered. And it's good and charitable to acknowledge those valid points. If they meet the agreed upon criteria and they show that is not as strong as we thought, we should acknowledge their point rather than shifting the criteria or moving the goalpost in order to make their counter-argument invalid. So it's okay to admit that we've made a mistake or that we misspoke. Number 4, we need to be consistent. You need to be consistent. Make sure that you are applying the same standards and criteria consistently for all of your arguments and for all of the evidence presented, whether they support your position or whether they challenge your position. And this would help if we each have a very solid foundation in understanding the hermeneutical rules of interpretation. But we have to be consistent because when we're inconsistent, people can see that. And it doesn't make us appear to be those who have a good grasp on the subject. Number 5, we need to avoid ad hoc changes. Avoiding ad hoc changes. We need to resist the temptation to change the criteria in response to new information or arguments that we might find challenging. Let's evaluate this new information that is brought to our attention within the established framework. Let's avoid making those changes. Number 6 is something that I think only each individual person can do, is that we need to reflect on our own motivations. Reflect on your personal motivations. So be aware of any biases or motivations that you might have in this discussion. We all have them. You can't act like you don't have them. The point is to try to not have them, but everyone has a bias or multiple biases when it comes to motivating their debates. Let's ensure that our goal is to seek the truth or to find common ground rather than winning a particular argument. So it comes down to our own motivations of a debate. And I think it's also good to never assume the motivations of another person. That's going to be another fallacy that we'll talk about in weeks to come. Number 7, we need to engage in good faith. We need to have good faith engagements with others. Let's approach the discussions with an open mind and a willingness to revise our position if presented with compelling evidence. And this helps us to maintain a view of the discourse that is honest and that is fair and that is worth listening to. Let's have an open mind, and if someone brings evidence to us that we haven't considered, then we need to walk away from that debate and we need to think, okay, maybe I need to reconsider my particular position, at least on this argument or on this particular passage. That's the purpose of a debate. That's what we hope that our arguments do towards our opponents. We want them to have an open mind and to be willing to revise their position. We have to be willing to do the same thing as well, because it's possible that we are presenting a debate and our opponents will actually have the better argument. And lastly, it's important to realize that when we adhere to these particular principles, we can avoid the fallacy of moving the goalpost and the case of special pleading. And this will result in more productive and in fair discussions that are enjoyable, not just for the people that are involved in the debate, but also for those that are watching, whether in the live audience or those that are watching online. They will enjoy the debate further if these fallacies are not being committed. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we examine another logical fallacy, the bandwagon fallacy. What is the bandwagon fallacy, and why is it hurtful to debates about God and Christ? Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes, by giving us an honest review on iTunes, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you'd like to offer a financial donation, you can check out the episode's description for a PayPal link, or you can subscribe with a membership on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.